Welcome. How's everybody doing tonight? Southern California is full of untold stories, but even more that go unheard.
Authentic first-person experiences of life in Southern California. Real people amplified.
Each show is unique because of who's involved and where we are. Some of our folks are experienced storytellers. Many are not. And for some, this is their first time on stage or speaking in public.
And tonight's show is reflective of the range of voices, experiences, and perspectives of those involved.
Together, we explore our region one story at a time.
A special thank you to the California Wellness Foundation for their generous support of this project.
No show would be complete without a host. Please join me in welcoming your unheard LA host, Bruce Lemon.
Welcome to Unheard LA, a deeper listen. I'm your host, Bruce Lemon, joining you from your home, from my home. And yes, we're still here in a pandemic, but kind of post-election and maybe sort of with the vaccine on the horizon. Certainly some good news, folks. Best of all, you still have a solid excuse to not go to that party you didn't want to go to anyway. We'll be back together again in a live person show someday. Maybe not soon, but someday for sure. In the meantime, we're taking this opportunity to reconnect with some of our Unheard alumni. We're coming together from all over SoCal, and we'd love to know where you're safer at home. Usually at a live show, we'd all shout out where we're coming from. And since we're not with you live right now, just sing it out loud so your neighbors who haven't seen you since October know you're still alive. I'm broadcasting from Watts, and the Unheard LA team is reporting from duty all over SoCal, like in San Dimas, Highland Park, Pasadena, West Athens, Altadena, Glassell Park, South Pasadena, Diamond Bar, and beyond. So, let us all know where you are, folks. We have much to discuss. Although we now know who will be in the White House come January, we're still in a very divided America. And we're now in the holiday season where people are going to find ways to safely connect with their families. There are bound to be some hard conversations, some necessary conversations. President-elect Joe Biden said in his acceptance speech that America has always been shaped by inflection points, by moments in time where we've made hard decisions about who we are and what we want to be. So, how do we make these decisions together? We vote, we protest, we talk, we listen. Listening perhaps being the most difficult in that list, but now that we have each other's attention, we felt this is a time to revisit some of the stories shared on the Unheard LA stage that reflect on the ways in which race, racism, and identity have shaped lives and experiences in Southern California. A deeper listen that I hope can lead to a deeper understanding, compassion, and change. Each story will be followed by a conversation with 4 amazing people. But first, I'd like to introduce Dana Amihere. She's the editor and award-winning designer, developer, and data editor of KPCC and the LAist, and co-editor for Race in LA, and editor of Racism 101. What's up, Dana?
Hey, I'm doing great. How you been since the last series?
I've been pretty good. Surprisingly. There's ways to find joy out here, folks. So the next hour, we're going to share some of the stories. But first, allow me to introduce you to our Unheard LA alums, Angela M. Sanchez, Matt Sedillo, and Jin Yoo-Kim. How you all doing?
Still blinking and breathing in quarantine.
If I was doing any better, my name would be Bruce Lemon.
I'll take that. I will take that. So Dana, why don't you tell us a little bit about Race in LA and Racism 101?
Sure. So Race in LA has been around since last June. It's an essay series where we ask Angelinos to reflect on how race and identity shape their everyday lives. It now has several sub-projects as part of the ecosystem, and that includes Racism 101, which started as a community engagement piece of our last Deeper Listen virtual event series. Our audience started asking us how they could facilitate their own really thought-provoking discussions on their own when they saw what we were able to produce. So we created a starter kit with tough questions to help them get the ball rolling on meaningful conversations. And we included several anti-racism resource guides to help inform and educate. Bruce, what do you think? You think we should get things going?
I think we should. That sounds like an amazing resource that I hope people take advantage of so we can learn more about each other and what each other is going through, and we can, have a deeper understanding of what life is. Now, for our first story, It's been over a decade since the Great Recession hit our nation, and many of us are still feeling a range of effects. It's created a whole generation of side hustlers, shaped by the struggles and hard lessons of our parents, making it work for us against all odds. Here to share how she was affected, Angela M. Sanchez.
1 week before Thanksgiving, in November 2007, I stared dumbly at the barren room. Our dining table was dismantled, its accompanying chairs lined up against walls devoid of family pictures and once-beloved bookcases. This year, there would be no handmade stuffing to prepare and no friends to have over. Each instinct I possessed screamed this wasn't right. How was I not dreaming? The news said so. The housing bubble collapsed. Development and architecture fields were the first areas hit. Work for my dad soon evaporated. He worked briefly at a supermarket, bussing carts and stocking produce, then borrowed, then budgeted, then the pink notices on our door appeared. Pay or quit. Another week in, we knew we didn't have money for upcoming attorney fees. We got packing. To where, I didn't know. I was 16. We had no other home. Dad barked marching orders around his cigarette and loaded a record-packed case into my hands. My dad loved his music. I had the bragging rights of growing up in a giant iPod with primordial CDs, read records. But not anymore. Just last week, Dad's Victrola, his favorite fixture, had been given away with some accompanying Blue Jay records. He wasn't ready to part with the 45s or LPs yet. So, completely on autopilot, I followed him out of the apartment and down to the garage to load up more boxes. When I was packing all my possessions into box after box, it didn't feel like it was happening to us or happening to me. It was a surreal experience. Like I was storing away all these belongings for some pharaoh's afterlife, for someone who'd passed away. I was packing for anyone other than myself, some other dying girl. I won't forget that whole hectic month leading up to our eviction. I would walk home from school almost every day, and I'd try to memorize every step. When this was finished, memories would be all I could claim of home. Because really, you end up missing the littlest things. I'd never get to walk home with my friends again after school. I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be going to the same school. I'd never get that same view from my window again. I had to trash my glow-in-the-dark stars and handmade mobile. I remember pacing the short 15 feet from the television to the end of the dining area, declaring that so long as this was my home, I would not forget any of it. These were little things, but they were mine. At least until the afternoon on our last day. At 1 o'clock, my adrenaline gave out after a whole morning of worrying and just a few hours sleep. So I lay down on the bed to close my eyes for a bit. The slamming of a fist on the door made my eyes snap open wide, and I found a damp spot of drool. The clock read 1:15. The pounding sounded louder. My father opened the door to 2 police officers. The first cop asked us what we were still doing here. I wanted to say we live here, but according to the paper with a bright red print, we didn't. We had to leave. Order from on high. My dad wanted to get the duffel bag we had prepped with basic necessities. The officer tried to follow him down the hall, but it was a tiny hallway, and with my bulky backpack, I got in the way. As a policeman shoved past me, I still remember his exact words. "Excuse me, ma'am." Ma'am? Ma'am, I'm only 16. I'm not even legal yet. I couldn't even vote to change the stupid policy that says I have to leave the only home I've ever known. Ma'am? But when people hear the word homeless, they don't see children. And in that moment, no one saw me. In less than a minute, my dad and I were forced out the door. Our locks changed in front of us. My family didn't belong anywhere. But in the ancient rickety Bonneville, my dad looked over at me with a smirk. "Feels good to be free, doesn't it, kid?" he said. At first I gaped at him. We were just evicted. I had just joined the ranks of 13,000 homeless children in LAUSD. And my dad, my foundation, was talking about freedom when we didn't have much choice in getting to go or stay. But as my dad would say, in these situations, you can laugh or you can cry. Well, it feels pretty good to laugh.
That was Angela M. Sanchez sharing her story from our Unheard LA show at the Centinela Valley Center for the Arts in Lawndale. The piece is entitled Eviction. Angela joins us now with two other Unheard LA storytellers, Matt Sedillo and Jin Yoo-Kim, as well as Race in LA co-editor Dana Amihere. Dana?
Angela, that was a really powerful piece. In it, you describe home as a physical place and emotional space and memories to hold on to. You were 16 when your family was evicted. What is home to you now? What is it?
I would say that home to me now is still very much how I would have articulated at that age. It's a sense of personalization. It's a sense of privacy. It's that sense of permanency. There's a lot of tenets of mental health that come with having a home. And I think it's something that many of us actually take for granted when we're housed. I could name a million different things that you can do simply by having a home that you otherwise wouldn't get to. I mean, whether it's Netflix and chilling, taking a hot shower whenever you want, getting to relax and unwind and recuperate from a long day in your own bed. It's that security and that stability. When my dad and I got a home again, we got those pieces of our humanity back.
Does anybody else want to chime in? Like, what does home feel like to you? I mean, and what would it feel like to just suddenly not have it anymore?
I've grappled with this question for a bit. You know, people always say, like, home is where your heart is, but if your heart isn't there, then what? So since I was separated from my family as a kid, or from my parents, I grew up with my grandmother, it was always hard for me to understand what it really felt like. And but I think as a secondary home, it was just piecing together things that Angela mentioned, just like comforts, security, like knowing that you have a place to go home to, as like a shelter. And yeah, those were some of the things that I gravitated towards. And one thing that actually stuck with me, Angela, when you were doing your piece, was the way that it was almost like an out-of-body experience, the way you described seeing yourself almost like from a kind of like, I don't know how else to describe it, but like an out-of-body experience where you're like kind of looking at your own life, but through a different lens and trying to memorize everything.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, it's very surreal when you're being evicted, and we had just barely enough time to salvage some of our own personal possessions. And because it's a trauma, there is a lot of self-separation that you go through. The idea of you're packing things for somebody else, because if you're packing for you, that's too real and that's too scary. And so even as a teenager, you don't want to make the immediate association of, oh, this is happening to me right now. A lot of it, I will also say, is in part due to the stigma that our society ties to being homeless, and the way that being evicted is obviously one of the starting processes of homelessness. We're seeing a lot of it right now, especially with the pandemic and the ensuing recession that's following it. And in some areas across the country, lifts on eviction moratoriums. But Really, it's also, we don't talk about being homeless. And whenever anyone hears the word homeless, there's a very set stereotype that comes to mind. They don't see families, they don't see children, they don't see college students. And all of these are populations that are affected by homelessness.
One of the things that I read a long time ago, something to the effect of like things you carry, or if you only had a few minutes to, like, your house was burning down or you were sent to a desert island, like what would you throw in a backpack or what would you throw in a bag? Like what are your most cherished possessions that you would carry with you from your home or to remind you of home? Did you ever get that sense or that feeling as you were um, uh, Angela, as you were being evicted, that you had to, pick and choose the parts of your life that were going to be the most precious to you? Or Jen, as you said that you were living with your grandmother in a different country. Did you feel like when you left, you had to, pick and choose what was going to be, your most cherished items to remind you of home? Or Matt, have you ever felt like you've had to, pick and choose what pieces of your home or your identity you have to cherish most?
Well, actually, for a period of time in Dallas, I was homeless. So, I was living in my car. So I didn't actually have a roof over my head. So I had a car roof over my head. And I was couch surfing a little bit too, but for like about a month and a half, I was actually out. And what I most remember distinctly was just being very angry about seeing a world I couldn't touch. Like, what I'm saying, like just walking around and I don't, I had a job, so I was working retail at the time. But I got the job and but I didn't get my paycheck until, like, it was one of those things where they keep the first week, so you're not gonna get it for 3 weeks, and just pretty standard stuff. So it was a period of time that was pretty rough. But what I most remember from that time period was just being really angry about being in a world where I could see the world and I could see a world of people, and I couldn't really be a part of it. I'd almost rather just have like a little pocket knife and be in the woods, because I could just go, stab a fish or something. But like to just be like in the world and not be part of it in certain types of ways was pretty horrible experience.
Yeah, it's sort of like if the world didn't want you to be a part of it, you were just gonna, turn inward and, not want to be a part of anything.
Yeah, and thanks for also mentioning that you were employed too. I feel like a lot of people don't realize how many people are poor, are homeless, and are working actively. And it's almost impossible to escape this self-perpetuating cycle of poverty. When my dad and I were in a shelter, the shelter had a strict cutoff time of when you had to be in their parking lot, of when curfew was. The lights went off at 9 o'clock. I had 5 AP classes in high school. I didn't go to bed at 9. When my dad bargained with the shelter's director, I didn't go to bed at 10 o'clock either for my extended curfew hour. It's really difficult how, even when you're in a supportive system, how challenging it is to actually find real support. And as a high school student, I didn't tell any of my friends, I didn't tell my teachers what was going on. I kept it to myself. Also because at school, kind of like your experience, Matt, it gave me that outlet to participate in a place where I didn't have to acknowledge my very real circumstances. At school, I got to be like a nerd, a dictionary, a teacher's pet, all these flattering titles. But it gave me a chance to have an identity other than my circumstance of being homeless.
So in some ways, home is kind of a piece of you, but it's not necessarily your entire identity. In some ways, people may try and make it define you, but you've tried to find ways to not make it define you, like to find other parts of your identity.
I also talk about this too whenever I have these discussions with volunteers, or I'm on the board for School on Wheels, Inc., a Los Angeles-based nonprofit that provides tutors and other academic supports to K-12 students experiencing homelessness. And so if I'm talking to even a potential donor, it's about how do we understand and support our students in the context of their goals and aspirations beyond their present circumstances. I became familiar with School on Wheels actually first because when I was homeless, I had a tutor through their program. Long story short, I really needed a math tutor. I was taking AP Calc. Full disclosure, I was a history major. And so I went running over to the School on Wheels volunteer tutor coordinator and said, I need a math tutor like yesterday. And they didn't just get me any math tutor, they found me a graduate student in astrophysics from Caltech. So I literally had a rocket scientist helping me with my math homework.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was fantastic. And he didn't see me as hashtag homeless kid, but as a girl who had, again, lost a sense of privacy and permanency and wanted more than anything to go to college. The fact that he was a graduate student meant that I got a tiny little peek into that post-secondary space. I'm a first-generation college student. And so I got to go to Stephen Hawking's lectures. Caltech was the first campus that I ever visited before I was even enrolled at my now alma mater, UCLA. And so having that kind of support where an individual is this outside breath of fresh air really makes a difference. And when we would have volunteers who would come over to serve dinner at the shelter, the best thing they could ask is just, how's your day going? What's happening today? How's school going? What are what's on your mind? Or what's the thing you're really looking forward to? Acknowledging that we're in a space that is a shelter, but also acknowledging that we were all families in a very difficult position. Everybody had different lived experiences and different backstories. But really, it was just a chance to feel normal and have conversation and be acknowledged for who we are as people.
Yeah. That's really powerful, Angela. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, the loss of home is hard, but it's even more important to, just be treated humanely and, like a person. Just because you've lost a thing doesn't mean that you've lost your humanity. With that, I'm gonna kick it back to Bruce.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Angela. Especially the part about the tutors in school helping see a vision past the circumstance that is happening right now, but into like your goals and what you want and what and the support that you're giving these the youth in that program is pretty amazing to hear. Thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to our next storyteller, folks, so we can keep having this conversation. Who are you? What are you? Where are you from? Some of us get these questions thrown at us weekly, sometimes daily. Responses to this can vary, especially when it comes to the art of a slam poet. Please join me in welcoming Matt Sedillo.
I was born on the east side of Los Angeles, across the tracks from abandoned steel, an industrial petrified forest. Across the steps, a giant green tarp protected customers and gossipers, our abuelitas, from rays of sun and the bombs of birds. They spoke Spanish, sold mangoes, papayas, and cherries, my favorite. As a child, I could never quite make the connection between the broken, empty bottles across the steps and the broken, empty men poured out the rust factories from across the tracks. So my cousins and I would gather rocks of dirt aimed directly for the head, and the men would yell back something like, "What do you kids know about life?" And we yell back, "Take that, drunks!" That was messed up. But that's just how it was. Growing up, where Valley climbs up and over Mitsoto, El Sereno. In the 1950s, my mother's father, a technician by trade, by birth, a prince among men, in a backwards kingdom that held him back, that treated him different for the radiance of his unapologetic brown skin, raised a family of 6 on a single income. There is hard-fought genius in me, older than my mother's womb. December 18th, 1981. After months of fear and absence, my father makes his return. My aunt moves to protect hospital bed. She does not want to see you. You know what you did. It would be best for everyone if you were just to leave. My mother holds her newborn, her only begotten son. There is a pain in me, older than my father's blood. As a child, I could never quite make the connection between his fingers around my throat and the anguish in his chest, a suffering older than my father's bones. his father's whiskey. Grandfather's short temper, long-lived legacy to a time history does not care to remember, because beatings are not fit for scrapbooks and genealogies of shame rarely make their way to the oral tradition of campfire. There is a burning in my heart that time cannot trace. Moved out from my father's, the suburbs treated me different. One day in the workforce, I told my boss, last night I met a woman, beautiful and intelligent, asks, where at? Boyle Heights, where's that? The east side of Los Angeles. Asks, incredulous, you met an intelligent woman in East Los Angeles? I wanted to slap the cavalry from his smirk. Beat the manifest destiny out of his name badge, but needing a paycheck, I stood in the weakness of silence, the pain and anguish of generations long past alive, and sickened in my chest there is a shame attempted upon us, older than the tongues of bigots. Walked off job, marched off lot, fist up for the cause, because in a world that has told us no, that has told us different, I've chosen yes. Yes, I'm Chicano. Yes, Mexicano. Yes, indigenous. Yes, I brown skin and bleed red. Yes, unafraid and unashamed. My passion, my potential, my intelligence. Yes, the fire in my chest. Look into my eyes, you could feel its strength. And yes, as a matter of fact, some of the most radiant, gifted, talented, beautiful, intelligent women I have ever met reside on the east side of Los Angeles, just across the steps from the streets where I was born. Yes, I am all of this and more. Yo soy la raza cósmica. I, like you, am made of stars. You, like me, so full of pain, are brimming with genius. Listen to no one who would make you feel different.
That was Matt Sedillo with his piece from our Unheard LA show at the Downey Theater in Downey. The piece is entitled El Sereno. Matt joins us now with two other Unheard LA storytellers, Angela M. Sanchez and Jin Yoo-Kim, as well as Race in LA co-editor Dana Amihere. Dana?
Matt, your piece just brims with your pride in being Chicano, in being Mexican, and in being from East LA. You talked about not really understanding certain things until you were older, the broken bottles, the broken men who discarded them. How do you, how do we stay connected to our physical home, our ancestral home, our emotional home? I mean, you touched on kind of all of those things.
It's interesting that the question that would arise is about the pride, right? And so in many ways, this poem has a 3-act structure of the pride, the pain, and then the triumph, right? So, but all these things, pride, pain, and triumph, all predate me. The story begins before I'm born, right? So it talks about these things reaching back to my mother's father, to my father's father, and to conditions that predate me, and that they come before me, both on a personal level and on a larger social level, right? So why would this question, even of being proud to be Mexican or Chicano, or proud to be from the east side of Los Angeles, from Sereno specifically, but the east side in general, why would these questions even come up? Well, because people try to make you feel ashamed of these things, right? And so this kind of pride becomes like this counterbalance. I come from a group of people in this country who, I've talked to a number of people who excelled in academia and in the arts and stuff like this, and they all have this story. They all have the same story about showing that they had some real potential and got punished for it. This is a constant. It's a question that you couldn't have possibly done that. You were cheating somehow. That's kind of just and that's not a revelation to anybody. That's not a revelation. What I'm saying right now, really? They have a movie about it. It's called Stand and Deliver. Anytime you excel, they accuse you of cheating. So that's kind of what that experience came from. So that's kind of when I talk about that pride. So I'm proud because you're telling me to be ashamed, and so that's what kind of fight back comes from. But there is plenty to be proud of, and everyone has something to be proud of. And this concept of a pride that predates me, a concept of a pain that predates me, and reasons why I will prevail that also predate me, is what that poem El Sereno was all about. And that's, when you ask me about an ancestral home, an emotional home, I mean, that's what that poem was about. It was about calling on the strength, these things that you are a part of, that have a history before you, and hopefully have a resolution on the horizon that you can be a part of, that will not only make your life better, but also make the generations to come lives just a little bit better.
We are multitudes. You come carrying your whole lineage with you, and everything they've been through, and all the hardships they faced, and everything that had to come together for you to exist in this day. We're bringing it all with us, especially if it comes from any kind of hardship that you can directly connect to from your direct experience, that just automatically connects to those ancestral bonds.
One last thing, I mean, like that poem El Sereno, I mean, what I'm talking about is it's right there in Hillside Village, is where I grew up on Jones, and there was actually, when I was a kid, they built a wall to prevent us from going across to what used to be the this dirt lot. And then, I'm like maybe 7 or 8 years old when this happens, and then the next year they put barbed wire over that wall. So that's my first experience with this concept of a wall being built up. And I'm just a child, and we're just walking across to, it's kind of like a little neighborhood, kind of place where we would buy fruit. So all of a sudden there's developers come, now they can put up a wall, now they put barbed wire over the wall to prevent us from climbing the wall. So this is my experience as a very, very young child, and my first real experience of like what the country as a whole thought about, people of Mexican descent, thought of Chicanos, thought of people from, living on the east side of Los Angeles. So, that's what that poem's about.
When you're describing that idea of kind of being a wall being built between in your poem, like you literally, there's a physical barrier there. It got me thinking about just the idea of being blockaded out of your own home, or being pushed out of your own space, or being pushed out of your own home. Can we just talk a little bit about that experience? I mean, Angela, obviously your piece talked about the physical, being pushed out of your own home, but I mean, even in just the emotional sense of being pushed out of, spaces that people say that we don't belong in for certain reasons, like whether it's the color of your skin, or where you came from, or where you're, the language you speak, or whatever. I mean, what are some of those experiences?
I mean, Los Angeles in and of itself is a history of erasure. We call Tongva Gar the land of the Tongva people who have historically occupied Los Angeles and still presently occupy Los Angeles, by a name that came from a European colonizer. And even then, we also don't say the full name of Los Angeles either. We don't call it the town of Our Lady, the Queen of the Angels. We'll shorten that straight to LA. And so there's a constant permutation of this, and also very much a history of displacement from our first indigenous people who have lived here, to also the use of even sheer geography to tell people where they can and can't live. I feel like a lot of folks now call downtown LA or Echo Park the East Side, when in reality the East Side is defined by the Los Angeles River. And that river is used to say, okay, all the people who are brown, black, Jewish, not yet white, move over here. And that's how that division has been historically drawn. And to this day, there are still very persistent equity gaps in Los Angeles.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned like this almost geographical segregation that we have going on in Los Angeles. It's like, the west side is this, the east side is this, the south is this, it's whatever. I mean, it brings up this bigger question to me as being, I'm sort of an outsider. I've only been in LA just a couple of years, and I've bounced all over the country. So I feel like I've kind of got a home base that I grew up in, but I'm kind of from all over. But it's like, who do we decide is okay to like be invited into the fold? I mean, to be perfectly blunt, who's invited to the cookout? Like, who's okay to enter our space and join our community? Like, what are the rules, unofficial or unspoken or unwritten? Like, who says this person is, or that person is okay?
I think it kind of depends on how you're coming into the conversation. You know, if you're born and raised from one neighborhood versus if you're just coming into the neighborhood, totally ignoring the people that were there before, totally ignoring what you buying into that neighborhood does to the people that are in the neighborhood before, not talking to anyone and then calling the cops when it's loud. Like that's a very different situation. That is someone coming into to an environment and trying to make it their own and disregarding the people that were there before, which is, as you said, Angela, it's the history of Los Angeles. It's happening in every single neighborhood, nationwide, of course, but in Los Angeles, you can see it. You can see how that gentrification carried out by different groups over time, over and over and over again, has consistently pushed people out and made them unwelcome.
Not to throw shade on, I know, a momentous year for our local team, but the Los Angeles Dodgers themselves are a part and parcel of that history.
Yeah.
With the history of the three neighborhoods of what we now call Chavez Ravine, La Loma, Bishop, and Palo Verde, we don't talk about that, and many of their children and progeny are still around, and for some folks, it's very much still in living memory. It's funny how history really hasn't changed. It came out of a very contentious conversation about what does socialism look like. And when these neighborhoods were promised public housing, that was torn out from underneath them because of Red Scare tactics that were being pushed by the very mayor of Los Angeles at the time.
Mm-hmm. And the Times.
We could have a whole special just on this.
Oh, yes, we could.
Oh, yes, we could. I feel like I'm getting flashbacks to our last virtual event series. But in the interest of time, Bruce, I'm going to kick it back to you.
This city is known for its diversity. And with that comes every kind of cuisine you ever knew existed. Any given bite can transport you around the world or bring you home. Here to share a bite, please welcome Jin Yoo-Kim.
I was 4 years old, and my mom told me that we were going to go to a place called America. Before then, I had never traveled far from our home in Santa Cruz, Bolivia. So when she said we were leaving to America, I had no idea that it was going to be a semi-permanent situation. It hit me when I was on the plane, and I started crying, thinking about all my Korean Bolivian friends I was leaving behind, my puppy, my home. In order to console me about the big move, my mom started describing the toilet paper we could expect in America. To give you some context, in Bolivia, toilet paper was usually recycled and dyed green or burgundy. Of course, now it's different, but back in the 80s, that's what everybody used. I had never really seen white toilet paper before. We were sitting on the airplane, and I remember clearly my mom telling me how the American toilet paper was white, and that some of them had designs on them, and that it was perforated. For a 4-year-old hearing that, when your whole life you've been wiping your butt with scratchy green or burgundy toilet paper, it means something. It was impactful. My mother should have been a marketer because she definitely knew how to speak my language. I thought, wow, what is this new place where people thought about designing soft, white toilet paper? If they care about the small things in life, maybe it's a paradise with its manicured lawns, shiny cars, rules and safety, elevators, escalators, and automatic sliding doors. One of the first memories I have of settling in Miami was going to a big Walmart-type supermarket. My little brother and I were playing around with these magic sliding doors, shouting commands to make them open, and somehow my brother's arm got stuck inside the sliding door. A security guard had to come and pry him out of it. I remember another time, someone had dropped a jar of mayonnaise on their lawn, and it just laid there for days, this half-broken glass jar of mayonnaise. I was surprised there were no street dogs, birds, or rodents who had come to scavenge it. America, the land of automatic traps and no animals, the land of waste. By the time I was in the first grade, we moved to Los Angeles. I settled into my new life in Westwood near UCLA, living with my brother and grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment while my parents went back to live and work in Bolivia. Our weekly allowance for groceries was $60. My grandmother would buy cheap Korean vegetables all the time, but still made sure that there was always a little piece of meat in all of our meals. We never had enough money for an entire meat entree like a steak dinner. We didn't have a turkey for Thanksgiving. We celebrated it Korean style with little meat patties and egg-covered fish. My grandmother was one of those tiger grandmas who used the guise of being frugal to not allow us to eat junk food. Like, the only junk food we were able to have at that time was this round Korean popped rice cracker called 뻥튀기.
It was the most boring, bland, carb junk food in the world. It's not even worth the calories. I think that's why she bought it, because it was always on sale. She knew we would never snack on it. It was some type of survival skill training or a nutritional sustenance if you're a Korean astronaut living on a spaceship and you're forced to eat something. I always felt culturally very different from everyone else because of the food I was eating. Because I was rarely allowed to buy Cheetos, Doritos variety packs, Sun Chips, Capri Sun, or Lunchables. I knew of these brands because it was all the stuff everyone else was eating daily, and I wasn't. I brought homemade fried rice and rice balls to school. Kids would make fun of me, and I would chuck it. I look back now, and my adult self cries at all the chucked lunches that my grandmother made so lovingly. When I was in elementary school, around 9 years old, our neighbor was a UCLA student. She rang the bell, and I answered the door. She gave me this box of half-eaten key lime pie. She said she threw a party, and she had all these leftovers, and she couldn't finish it all, so do we want some? I had never seen a key lime pie before. I knew about apple pies. I thought pies started and ended with apple pies, and there were only variations of that, like those individually packaged ones you could get at McDonald's. I didn't realize that there were other kinds. I had no idea there was pecan pie or a key lime pie or even cheesecake. I didn't know about cherry pie, and I definitely didn't know about sweet potato pie. This was the first time I was introduced to a non-apple pie. Then my brother and I took this half-eaten pie and we studied it. We didn't tell our grandma. We were scared she was going to take it away from us. So we got our forks, dug in, and finished the entire thing. I was not only taken aback by how delicious the key lime pie was, but also how it finally made me feel connected to the American culture. If you go to the supermarket and you buy Cheetos or whatever, you're buying into the American culture. But it was the first time an American person was like, hey, I want to share a piece of my culture with you. I don't know if I understood the importance of it at the time because I was a young kid, but I still remember it, and that memory like it was just yesterday. My brother and I lived with my grandmother for 10 years while my parents were in South America. During that time, I lost my tourist visa, and I became undocumented along with my grandmother. While I didn't yet feel the ramifications of losing my status, I did have this sense of becoming even more marginalized. But at that moment, when my neighbor shared her half-eaten pie with us, it represented this window to the entire world, offering me a bit of hope, even as I felt so alone, so far from my parents, and in a country that didn't want me. I can probably trace back my foodiness to this moment. To this day, key lime pie is still my favorite. It's my brother's favorite too. It's a love that goes deep, all the way back to the way the white, fluffy, creamy thing sat on top of this tart, custardy pie, and how it was just so balanced and made your facial expressions come alive. My gateway pie. The first time I realized there was a world beyond this. Like my first pecan pie, my first sweet potato pie, my first Thanksgiving meal that looked like an American Thanksgiving meal, not rice and soup. This is something that I remember helping me feel more American instead of being a guest on this land. I was invited to take part of it. I finally felt American as key lime pie.
That was Jin Yoo-Kim sharing her story from our Unheard LA show at the Aratani Theater in Little Tokyo. The piece is entitled Key Lime Pie. Jin joins us now with two other Unheard LA storytellers, Angela M. Sanchez and Matt Sedillo, along with Racing LA co-editor Dana Amihere. Dana?
Jen, I have to say, your very humorous take through a kid's eyes of what it's like to assimilate into a new culture and into a new country through a dessert was a delightful thing to listen to and to experience. But I guess on a more serious note, can you just describe what's the sort of disorientation that you feel, I guess the foreignness, like the strangeness that you feel, I mean, especially as a kid, being just plunked down in a new place that's suddenly supposed to be your new home. It's like, you go from, this is my homeland, and like, this is now supposed to be my new homeland.
I feel like I had 3 experiences like that. So even before I came to the US, my childhood life, when I think back at it, I was only surrounded by my family members and my church for a long time, who were all Korean. And so I didn't quite understand how different I was until I went to school. So when I first went to kindergarten in Bolivia, I was like, me and my cousins and my brother were the only Koreans for miles. So that was my first culture shock of feeling like I'm different. I'm not really like a part of the society. I'm invisible, or I want to be invisible. When I came to the US, I tried really hard to blend in by being invisible. I just didn't want anyone to notice me. And it worked. Like, I remember not speaking from first grade until fifth grade, and I had braces for 2 years, and no one knew that I had braces. I still remember when, you know, like in kindergarten or first grade, when there were like songs where everybody, you know, like that song's like, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar? And then the teacher calls out a student's name and they pass it on. And I remember it was my turn and I didn't answer. And some other kid just, you know, jumped in and answered for me. And I was like, I never have to talk. I don't have to be visible. I can just kind of live on the margins. In a way, it felt comfortable. It felt like being invisible meant blending in. So it was kind of like my coping mechanism. But even now, I think there's not that many places that I feel like I totally belong. And even when I went to Korea, I was like, oh, I'm definitely not Korean. You know? And even my parents who left Korea in late 70s, they're in a time capsule. So the country has completely moved on without them. So it's like we're just in a little bubble and we just belong to each other. There's no like other places where we're like, okay, this is my home, my world, where I belong. So since then, I feel like I've been trying to find smaller niche communities where I feel like I belong here because I'm a filmmaker. I belong here because I'm Asian American, and that's more like pan inclusive in a way. But yeah, it's an ongoing thing, I think.
It's a really interesting way that you've described like trying to be, it's like this cloak of invisibility as a coping mechanism. I mean, it's almost like, you know, a superpower, trying to, as a being not there as a way of being there, that I think is a really kind of like meta thing that I'm trying to wrap my mind around right now. But one thing that struck me as you were talking, it's sort of like this idea, trying to figure out ways to assimilate by not only by not being there, but it made me think of times that maybe we've been shamed in our attempts to assimilate. And that's why we want to be invisible. I mean, in your case, it was just straight out of the gate. It was, I'm just going to try as hard as I can not to be seen. I mean, to the point where no one knew you had braces for years. But does anybody want to chime in on that? What are some ways that maybe you've tried to assimilate into new circumstances or new cultures or new situations, and you've either been like just shut down, or what are some of the ways that you've tried to enter in? Or like, have you been extended an olive branch, or have you been just completely shut out? Like, what's been your experience?
I think Matt and I have kind of the shared experience of being Chicano, Chicanx, and, you know, having come from a 2.5 generation Mexican American, so having come from a history of assimilation in my family. And it's sort of, Jin, to your point about being invisible, and yet when we hear the word ethnic, you know, we know that that doesn't include white people. And if you're white, you get to be unmarked by race. I mean, walk into a supermarket and try to find the tapatio or the sriracha, and you got to go to the ethnic foods aisle. You know, I think about how my dad used to tell stories about his dad, and the way that my grandfather, if the phone rang, he would he had to get his game face on, he would sweat, and he would be afraid to answer the phone because of his accent. And so my dad never learned Spanish. Similar reasons, my mom speaks broken Spanish, and I had to learn Spanish as a second language in high school. So I see how that it perpetuates itself to a collective family effort to try and protect you, and at the same time not realizing how they're hurting you.
In many ways, yeah, I share a lot of that with Angela. Of, you know, like I'm kind of the one with broken Spanish, and I kind of remember from my childhood speaking with my grandparents, but that was not, I was raised in a certain direction, so I have a certain level of fluency with the general society. But at the same time, when someone like wants to attack me, the immediate thing they'll call me wetback, a border hopper, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so there's no escaping it. I mean, there's even though like you're supposed to like kind of like whatever, like even though your experience as one thing, the general ideas that exist about you, if someone's trying to attack you, are always present, always available. So that's kind of that happened just like 2 weeks ago. Someone was saying those things to me. So like it's just really it's kind of it's just inescapable. It's a weird thing though. It's a weird experience to both kind of feel like disconnected from this thing from before, and also like be subject to the attack on this thing that you still are, like regardless of your ability, your fluency, or your background, your knowledge, or of who you actually are as an individual person. It's always present. So.
That duality that you're talking about, I totally understand where you're coming from. I wanted to go back to something that Angela said, that grocery store picture that you sort of painted. I've always considered like the ethnic or international food aisle as sort of this like also like a duality. It's like, okay, we're going to welcome you into the mainstream. We're going to give you your own aisle. We're going to put you with, the other kids, with the other things. You have your own aisle, but we're going to other you at the same time. We're going to put you among everyone else, but at the same time, you're different.
You can click on Hulu and they have like, I think it's Hulu or Netflix. It has a Latino genre. It's like, oh, I'm a genre. I don't get to be, I don't get to participate fully in drama or humor or whatever, and it's weird because no, it's not a genre. It's a population, and there's so much nuance behind that.
It's like they try and put us into these cultures and ways of living and ways of being, and identities suddenly become things that you can neatly tuck and trim and put into these little boxes that are, for consumption. And it's just, it's mind-boggling. But again, it's something that we could devote an entire special to. I do want to say that we are rapidly running out of time, despite the fact that, in COVID time, it seems like every day is about 57 years. I do want to, thank all of you for being here with us. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Bruce.
I really love your grocery store analogy there, Dana. You got the aisle that has all the ethnic foods in it, and then you have the rest of the grocery store. So what is the rest of the grocery store? Is this just non-ethnic foods? Is that what the rest of the grocery store is?
Gentrified produce.
Right.
And I have to say, the ethnic aisle never has black-eyed peas, and it never has the gentrified greens that they were always yelling about. I'm like, yeah, y'all.
Collard greens?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Y'all don't even get me started on the produce in the ethnic food aisle.
Yeah, we'd be here all night. Fortunately, that is all the time we have tonight. So let's jump into our tag at the end, folks. That is our show. Thank you for all the folks who joined us from KPCC and LAist that make Unheard LA possible, and to our extended Unheard LA family. Special thank you to Dana Amihere for the race in LA, for being a part of these deeper listen events, as well as being a catalyst for important conversations like these. We are eternally grateful to the California Wellness Foundation for their generous support and ongoing support of Unheard LA from the very beginning. KPCC and LAist members, you truly make everything we do possible. Everybody has a story. What's yours? Share with us at kpcc.org/unheardla. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our Unheard LA newsletter, the best way to be the first to find out about what's next. Speaking of, we'll be right back with the next installment of our Deeper Listen series a week from today. Once again, thank you for joining us. And remember, whatever you do, don't leave your story unheard. Bless you.